Hello and welcome to the Simple Faith Podcast. My name is Dave Betts, and together with my wife Sharia, we are exploring all the things that make our faith what it is. In other words, we are looking for authentic Christianity for normal people like you and me. We are trying to strip away all of those unnecessarily churchy or intellectual words. And if we do have to go there, we have to use some of those complicated words. We want to make sure that we're explaining them and not making any assumptions that you know them or that I know them. We just want to have a down-to-earth, regular conversation about the things of our faith. So with that in mind, we've had some pretty difficult conversations in the past. We've talked about calling. We've talked about what the Bible says about suffering. We've talked about what the Bible says about LGBT in the church. And last week, we talked about creation. And hopefully you found that really helpful. Today, I'm really excited that we're going to talk about the flood. And I'm joined again by Dr. Melia as we talk about the realities of the flood story. You might be familiar with it. It's in Genesis 6-9. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. But firstly, Sam, welcome back to the Simple Faith Podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me again.
It's great to have you here. Tell me something about you that I don't know.
That you don't know?
Yeah.
No, I've bared all with you, Dave. You know everything there is to know about me. There's bound to be a good one. My first television appearance. You were on television? I was 3 years old, and I was on the news because they were cutting down a local very old oak tree in our village. Whoa. And I was watching, and they interviewed me and said, "Are you upset?" And I said, "Yes, because I won't be able to climb it." What I'd not told them is that I'd never climbed that tree nor any tree in my life. But I was on the news for that reason. So there you go. You didn't know that about me.
That's very good. Have I ever told you that I was in a movie? I don't know if you know
haven't
that.
Told me you were in a movie. No,
I was in a movie at 5 days old. I'm at the end of this movie by someone called Polyakov. I think he's supposed to be a famous director. It was a BBC movie. I watched that movie like 2 years ago with Sharia, and it's the most boring movie I've ever seen in my entire life. It's about this old woman who just goes mad. And at the very end, I appear in it with lots of tubes Amazing. On me. I was very premature and I had lots of tubes on me. And just as the camera zooms in, I go like this. I just judder all of a sudden. It's like I know. I was made for TV.
It sounds like a fascinating film. It doesn't sound boring at all. It sounds like I'd watch it all the way through and I'd be waiting with bated breath for you to appear.
No, it was terrible. I've tried to watch it a few times. I wish I could tell you that it was good. I
More
never really got any callbacks.
Opinions.
That was it. That was my movie career done.
Just the start. Well, life's not over yet. You never know.
Yeah.
You could play Baby again.
Maybe. Yeah, I'll reprise my role as Baby.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, today we are talking about the flood. I really enjoyed our conversation last week, which actually, if I'm completely honest, was about 20 minutes ago. I
have not changed my shirt.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking about it. It's a big topic, and I hope that you found it helpful too, listening at home. We want to remind you that what we're not trying to do is force a view upon you. We want to talk about some of the pros and some of the cons of each view and recognize, as we did last week, that we want to approach these topics with humility, knowing that we just don't know the answers. Even the smartest of smart scientists, and Sam's got a PhD, we just don't know all the answers. And so with that in mind, Sam, let's talk a little bit about the flood. What is this flood story in Genesis 6?
Yeah, starting off in Genesis 6, we're told in the Bible that when the sin of mankind became so great that God ended up regretting that he'd even made people. And so he said, "I'm going to flood the world and destroy and kill people. But there is one righteous family left, and I'd like them, via the patriarch of that family, Noah, to build an ark and to be delivered through this flood that God was bringing to the world." And that's a pretty big claim for us people to look at the world and say, well, can we see that there? So I guess that's why we're here today to talk about it.
Yeah. So I guess if you zoom all the way back, the biggest question is, did the flood happen? And we're making an assumption here that yes, it did. And here's why. We talked about this last week. We're making some presuppositions, some assumptions. The first one is that God exists. Second one is that God created the universe out of nothing. The third one is that the flood actually happened. Why? Because of the fourth assumption, that we can trust the Bible. So because we believe that we can trust the Bible, we believe that there was some sort of flood. So what we're not going to do today is debate whether or not a flood happened, right? What we're going to do is talk about whether that flood was a local flood or a global flood. Let's maybe talk about that a bit more. What do we mean by global or local? It's pretty obvious, but let's maybe discuss it a bit.
We can break it down. So one of the interpretations of the flood story is that God told Noah that he would flood the world, and was referring to the known world at that time. So at that point, they were probably all living in Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia?
Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, it's modern day Iraq or thereabouts, kind of the central Middle East. Go on.
I was going to say, if you look at the area between two rivers in Iraq, if you were to go on Google Maps and look at two rivers, it's kind of this area that is between those rivers and that kind of area. The Fertile Crescent is called, but that's the area we're talking about, right?
And humanity has been living there for quite some time. In all kind of opinions on the origins of humanity and the creation of the world, people have been living there both in the biblical account and in the scientific account from for a very long time. And so the interpretation is that when there was a small number of people in the world, that perhaps God only needed to flood Mesopotamia. And then the larger, the global flood interpretation is that God needed to flood the whole world and to cleanse it completely and to remove any trace of kind of the evil that had festered there, in order to deliver Noah and his family to kind of a new and remade earth. And so we'll talk about those a little bit.
So we've got a local flood, a localized flood in that kind of area in the Middle East, or a global flood. I guess the best thing for us to do is to delve into the old Earth view that we looked at last week and how a flood could maybe be compatible with that, and then the new Earth view, and maybe we'll see any scientific issues. And I should say, which I didn't say from the beginning, that Sam, your doctorate, your PhD is in geomorphology. So this is an area of specialism for you. So this is quite an exciting thing to talk about.
So I've studied how the surface of the world has changed over time, what's affected that, and whether floods or tsunamis, which can be traced back to something called plate tectonics, the moving of the kind of the crust of the earth, how all that's been affected. And so it's certainly been a big question for me about kind of the nature of the biblical flood, and definitely as a Christian to be able to kind of try and analyze these things.
Great. It's such a joy to have you on this episode, Sam. I so appreciate having your vast knowledge in this area, because it's certainly an area that I don't have that level of understanding.
It's a joy to be here and certainly to talk about it.
Well, after the break, let's talk about the flood and the old earth and the flood and the new earth. Sam, let's talk about the old earth view. If you're listening at home and you didn't get to listen last week, the old earth view of creation is one of two predominant views. It's that God caused evolution, and humanity came about that way, or it's that it's this thing called gap theory, so that in between the days in Genesis 1, there were millions and millions of years. Now, the first theory, the evolution theory, is problematic for a number of reasons, but you can listen to last week's episode to figure out that. So let's assume that you believe in gap theory, maybe. How would a flood be compatible with gap theory?
Well, actually, I mean, we can probably combine both theories in how the flood would kind of flood would affect them. So for a global flood relating to an old earth, there's a big problem in that it has to be, at least according to the biblical narrative of it, it has to be in the time frame of human existence, because the aim is to wipe out humanity and for humanity to start again. In the context of an old earth with a rich history of kind of the formation of the world, the flood must have had an effect on the planet that, if we're to interpret what we look at the planet today as being a history of a long time, then the flood on a global scale would have done more than what we can see on the surface. So if you're looking at an old Earth interpretation, probably the more beneficial interpretation would be a local one, because local floods happen quite frequently. But there are some issues with that, which I'm sure we'll kind of push on a little bit later after we've finished breaking everything down.
Well, you know what? Let's dig into that now. I'm really interested to hear about that. So what you've just said, again, I want to make sure that I'm following you there. You're saying that that actually a flood would have to have happened after humanity came around, which is really in recent history, according to the old Earth view, which is, of course, that's so obvious, but that's something that I've never really connected with. Of course it would. But there's challenges with that. So you're saying probably a localized flood would make sense, but
from that perspective, certainly.
Yeah, but what are the challenges there?
Well, one of them is that every culture around the world, including ones that didn't have contact with each other for a very long time, and certainly these myths existed before they had contact with each other, there is a flood myth of some form, often with very kind of similar characteristics associated with every one of them. So you find the Native Americans in North America, and Incas and Aztecs, and there are Asian myths, and there are European myths and Aboriginal myths that all describe a flood that destroyed the world, and more often than not also describe a man or a family unit who are told to build some kind of a boat or an ark in order to be delivered through it. And so for something to be that widespread, and not just to have a flood associated with the myth, but to have very particular details stand out, does challenge the idea that one small flood, or perhaps many small floods that happened at different times, occurred to kind of bring this coincidence about.
Okay, so if the flood was relatively recent, so we're talking, let's say, I guess, could it be, in this theory, 100,000 years or something like that? What would you think? What would they like?
Sure. Our general understanding of humanity is that we've been around for, say, between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, as we see ourselves now.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, the kind of the old Earth interpretation of humanity does stretch on, and humanity changes the further back you go if you're to take an evolutionary approach to it. But as we understand humans to be now, maybe about 10,000-ish years ago, is when people turned up.
So if we're saying, let's say, for sake of argument, 9,500 years ago,
sure,
there was a global flood on this old Earth view. Would that global flood have, or even many localized floods? Would that have changed the geology? How would that work?
One of the things that we see when there are floods is huge deposits of sediment, and it forms in a very particular way. You have particularly catastrophic floods where water moves in very quickly. You'll have boulders at the bottom of a sediment bed where sand and rocks and things are deposited, and then as the flood rises, you kind of get thinner and thinner sediment, so it ends up becoming basically a big mud pile. And if the whole world was covered in a catastrophic flood, you would have to see these big, thick, kind of catastrophic sweeps of sediment, of sand and mud and rocks and things like that, which, if the world as we see it today is thought to have been formed predominantly before this, 10,000 year arbitrary point in time, where is all of that new sediment? Where has it come from? That's a problem that would rise.
So, okay. So if I'm understanding rightly, the problem with a global flood on an old Earth is that it would have had to have been very recent, which is what we're saying in the new Earth view anyway, is that it's very recent. But there's not sediment, which is a problem. So
yes.
So how does that all fit together?
Or certainly, I mean, we find sediment on the surface, but no evidence of something that happened on the broad timescale side of things, something that happened so recently that the world is still recovering from a relatively recent deluge. So we don't see that kind of effect.
Okay. So, I mean, so that's the old Earth. Some of the challenges with the old Earth, and some of the, I guess, the pros as well. But assuming you subscribe to a new Earth view of creation,
Mm.
How scientifically does the flood fit in with all of that stuff?
Well, things change up quite quickly. If you were to look at a map of the world and maybe kind of lift away the kind of recent human things like nation boundaries and things like that, and just look at the geology of the world, you see a big broken mess, lines carved through it, and mountains pushed up in interesting places, and great fault lines that have gouged the surface of the world open, and big basins full of sand that have moved there. We see a very rich and changing history, something that I've kind of dedicated a large portion of my past decade to trying to understand. And so we can look at that and try and see if in that history we can place the flood as part of that formation, which I believe we can do. I think we can see a lot of evidence for the flood having caused a lot of what may be interpreted to be old actually occurring very quickly and probably in a short space of time. And there is evidence for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to discuss or to unpack here. So would you mind if I put you on the spot and said, which one would you lean towards, Old Earth or New Earth?
Well, I've obviously received many a strange look from my colleagues when I've said this, but I subscribe to a young Earth interpretation. I believe that there's a lot of evidence to lean towards the fact that the world is young and the scars that we see on it happen catastrophically.
Yeah, I think I can go on record and say I think I agree with you. This is not us telling you that you should agree with us, but just to say that actually you can thoughtfully come to that conclusion without just giving up on science or giving up on on what the world is teaching us. So that's kind of beside the point, I guess. But assuming, I guess with both views, how could a global flood have occurred? I mean, if we're talking about the amount of water in the earth, right? I can't imagine how
that
so much. Sorry to, but I can't imagine how that could have happened with so much water in our earth. Suddenly to flood the whole earth. Like,
it's such a huge question, and it's actually probably the most important question: is where could all of that water have come from? And now we look at the world and see land masses above the sea level. Where did all that water go? And that's a really big question to tackle. There was actually a paper I was reading that came out this year, Current Science. And if any of you do want to look it up and kind of go reading for it, it's by the authors Dong et al. From 2021, and the title is "Constraining the Volume of Earth's Early Oceans with a Temperature-Dependent Mantle Water Storage Capacity Model."
Whoa,
that's that out of the way.
We'll get a link to that.
Let me break it down.
We'll just so you know, we'll have a link to that in the show notes so that you can
Fantastic.
Find that.
I'll break down what the paper is effectively saying is that the world has to have been covered in water at some point, given the fact that water is now chemically trapped within the mantle. So that's effectively the majority of what the planet is made up of. If you imagine the Earth as a sphere, you could use an apple as an analogy. The crust is the skin on the outside. The mantle is the white flesh of the apple, and then you have the inside, the core of the Earth, is where the pips and seeds and the bit that you don't usually eat happens. And so there's a lot of water chemically trapped in the mantle, the majority of the planet. And it's held there in rocks, in minerals such as olivine and things like that, which you can break down and call them.
Did you say
hydroxyl? Go on.
Olivine?
Sorry. Olivine, exactly. Yes, exactly. Like the delicious bar top snack. And I think it's called that because it's olive coloured. We're not very inventive when it comes to naming things, but we love to name things after food. Okay. But for a more boring name, hydroxyl groups are these names of minerals which trap water, not traps water in the same way that a sponge does, where it holds liquid water, but that chemically the atoms which create water, so hydrogen and oxygen, are held in these minerals and are released under certain occasions and are absorbed under certain other occasions.
Okay. Wow.
So big stuff. So yeah, we were asking about where water could have come and gone.
Yeah.
And the consensus amongst the scientific community, secular and non-secular, is that the world has to have been covered in water at some point or another, given just the chemistry of the planet and where it's all gone, and why we have so much water still left over now. Because we look at the rest of the planets in the solar system, including ones such as Venus, which isn't too much of a different distance from the sun that the water could have evaporated away, but just doesn't have that much water on it in comparison. Or certainly not liquid water anyway. We're in the nice spot in the solar system where Earth can have all this liquid water that we can drink and stay alive with. And then the second question is, if all of that water that was trapped under, in the mantle, so to speak, inside the Earth, how did it come out? And how did it go back in again? Do you want me to keep breaking that down?
Go for it. Yeah, let me ask that question for you.
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying that there is water covering the Earth. Scientists believe that, but obviously, at some point before there was a flood, according to the Bible, there was Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and so on. Yeah. In fact, there was an entire genealogy of people, which I think we'll come on to in a bit, because these people lived for a long time. So I think we should talk about that if we have time. But okay, so after the genealogy, the family tree in Genesis 5, there's a flood, which means the water comes. That could be the flood that we're talking about, where the world was covered in water. Where did it come from?
So there's a really key verse in Genesis 7:11, and it refers to the springs of the deep. And now you may have done some, nice mountain walking and found a spring of water coming out of the ground. This is referring to something that produces enough water that a catastrophic amount of water appears.
Yeah.
So if I were to just double back to the fact that there was potentially water trapped mineralogically in minerals in the planet, the reason why it's there is because of the amount of heat that was holding it there. And I won't delve into kind of too much of the overly complicated stuff, but basically the hotter these rocks were, the more water they could hold. Sorry, I've said that backwards, and I'm going to double back and say that properly. The hotter the rock is, the less water it can hold. So it would be the equivalent of boiling a kettle and the water starting to steam and bubble and try and escape. And so effectively, if the Earth became hotter, that water would come out of the minerals and become liquid water, and probably, due to the heat, come out as steam and break up the crust that's above it and flood out, fly into the sky, immediately cool down because it's now not near the kind of hot inside of the Earth, and start raining down, and it starts causing all sorts of trouble when it does that. If you've ever walked on a floorboard and it's broken and you've fallen through, imagine that on the scale of a planet, especially if you fall into some very hot water. So I'm of the opinion, and I'll break down what plate tectonics means, that plate tectonics is very key to this. So effectively, if you're to look at the surface of the planet and see these scars running across it, you can generally trace these scars into effectively patches of crust, patches of this apple's skin around the apple that have kind of they move together in one go, and the boundaries between them can kind of rub and brush against each other, or pull apart or push under one another. And that's very key to understanding the world and geology. And also I believe it has some really important implications for, therefore, how the flood affected it, or how it affected the flood. Okay,
yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, isn't there? I particularly like the fact that you said walking on a floorboard. I liked Christopher walking on a floorboard.
Walking on a floorboard.
But that's really helpful. I hope you're following at home. I'll be honest, I was struggling to keep up with some of that, which is, I guess, part of the course when you're talking to a PhD geologist.
I can break things down into kind of the bare bones as much as I may.
Yeah. Maybe can you summarize it in as small a way as possible?
Yeah. One theory is that water is trapped in the form of minerals rather than in the form of liquid water inside the planet. And it's trapped there for as long as the temperature is the right temperature. If the temperature changes, the water can come out of those minerals and break its way to the surface and cause all sorts of difficulties for the people who are standing there.
So that's one theory. There are lots of other theories as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are harder to reconcile with science and stuff. So we're not going to dwell probably too much on those. I think maybe what is good to say is that scientifically it is very possible that there was more water, before when Adam and Eve were around, and then it came out and then it has gone back in. And that's probably something that God brought about, whether in this kind of in the course of natural science, or whether he divinely pulls out that stuff, right? So that's what we're saying.
Yeah. I think it's a good way to break it
down. Are there any
down.
geological issues with this? So would this have any implications on how old we would see the Earth as being and stuff? I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, but
yeah, just a touch. I think it would, that the amount of water that we're considering would have a catastrophic change on how the surface of the planet would look. And we said that if we're looking at the planet more or less the way it is now, in an old Earth perspective, we would see all that catastrophe that happened recently and say, well, how did the old Earth form and change if the flood occurred? And we don't necessarily see that. If we're to look at kind of the geological implications of that happening and whether there's any difficulties there, the general opinion is that water likely was present before people, on the surface of the planet, and that it went away, mainly because you'd have to then explain what happens to all the people if the water is there. I think that the presence of what they're calling a water world, similar to the Kevin Costner movie, when the water world existed and affected the world, must have been before people and probably a very long time ago. So the two kind of things that we'll come up against is when the water was present in liquid form on the surface, and how it would have affected the surface, and kind of what that would look like.
Well, the really interesting thing about that theory is, and I think of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 verse 2. It says, now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Now, when I hear you describe that theory, it makes me think of that bit. So I guess my question is, assuming that this is what actually happened, which of course is still an assumption, could the water have been kind of up and down and up and down? Like, could it go back and forth?
Well, scientifically, there's a huge precedent for the fact that the sea level has changed over time. So one of the things I worked on was how looking at how sea level in Indonesia, for example, can tell us where the land masses have been and how they've developed over time. So there's no question that the sea level does rise and fall, and Genesis tells us that this is what God did. That the planet was covered in water, and that he then separated that so that the land stood proud of the water, and so that then there was land mass and there was water on the surface, and so there's no reason to believe that doesn't change again over time, because we see it happening now again with ice caps melting and water that's hidden in or locked away in, for example, the ice caps at the moment, melting and changing the sea levels now. So there's certainly precedent for it happening in the history of the planet, both kind of in a theological and scientific or perspective.
So I guess where we've landed so far is that the flood could have been global or local. We're assuming that there was a flood. It could have been global or local. Actually, what we're proposing is that, in our opinion, it tends to evidence tends to point to a global flood. But if you had an old Earth, probably it would needed to have been local, although there's problems with that. Of course, there's also challenges with a new Earth flood, with the 40 days and 40 nights and all that stuff, figuring out some of that stuff. But with that in mind, why don't we take a quick break here, I want to ask you some other questions. For example, I want to know about dinosaurs and genealogies and stuff like that. So let's have a quick break and then we'll talk about that before we finish the episode. Okay, welcome back to the Simple Faith podcast. We've talked about the flood so far. It might be a bit of a challenging listen if it's challenging some of your assumptions, challenging some of your presuppositions, and that's okay. It's okay to be challenged. It's okay to keep an open mind on some of this. Again, just to reiterate, what we are not doing is telling you what to believe. We're going to give you our opinions, of course, but what we want to present to you is that actually a global flood, as presented in Genesis 6-9, could actually have happened. Whether it was an old earth or a new earth is kind of beside the point. There are implications of both, but the point is that a flood could have happened and that science backs this up. Now, that's great, but there is a ton of extra questions that come in here, Sam, and the questions that I'm very interested to ask you. I did some papers on this kind of stuff when I was at Bible school, and one of the ones I did a paper on that I was really fascinated on was dinosaurs, and I would love to know what you think. And, so supposedly dinosaurs existed between 65 and 200 million years old. Again, according to Google, I'm not exactly an expert on this, but let's say, hypothetically, we believe in a new Earth, which means that the Earth is, maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years old or something like that. And we believe in a new Earth. Where do dinosaurs fit into this? And what about the flood?
Well, first off, don't switch off when I say this. Dinosaurs still exist today and still wander around. If you've ever been to Florida, there are some
I
in
thought
the
you were talking
swamps.
about the old people's homes.
No. Crocodiles and alligators I'll stick with are some really kind of obvious standouts for the fact that what we understand to be dinosaurs have existed and do still stick around. Similar things like, I don't know if you've ever seen the comparison between the footprint of an ostrich and that of the footprints that we see found in kind of the fossil record, and of how similar they are, and how species similar to dinosaurs that we know of from Jurassic Park and kind of popular media, and then the scientific papers, how they still hang around. And so, yes, there's countless evidence that they have existed, and certainly that they existed far more numerously than they do today. And I think the question is, as with where did all the water go, which I think we touched on a little bit earlier, in that, it can be trapped inside the earth. I'm not about to say dinosaurs are now trapped inside the earth and we've got a hollow earth situation. That would be a different podcast altogether. But that I'm of the opinion that the flood, give it the title of the episode, had a huge effect on the habitability of the world. And so if you imagine it, you said this at the beginning of the previous podcast, I enjoy gardening. And if you've got a plant such as a chili plant living in a greenhouse, and it's growing chilies and it's going really well, if you put it outside in the cold, it dies. And it doesn't produce any more fruit, and it can't survive. And I think it was a similar situation with the dinosaurs, that if a global flood occurred and dinosaurs were even kept to some extent alive by bringing kind of the species along with many of the others on the ark.
Let's pause there quickly.
I can already see that you're jumping into.
So you're saying a big old brontosaurus or whatever they're called with the huge long neck could fit into a boat. So how would that work?
Well, we've all seen the cartoons of giraffes on the ark, and nobody questioned that. But no, to take it more seriously, dinosaurs came in handy little packages when they're very young, in the form of dinosaur eggs. And so, and just in general, animals, so, you could keep elephants on board by having a number of very young elephants there. I think there's certainly precedent for the fact that these animals could have been transported there. And similarly, what with the huge variety of animals that we see today, there would certainly have been less of the kinds, in inverted commas, that we see today, you wouldn't have had to bring a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd on board. And similarly, with the variety of dinosaurs that we see in the records, there's probably a number of small, not small, a smaller number of kind of kinds of dinosaurs that existed. And so it's not outside of the realm of possibility.
So I think that's a really good point. If I'm hearing you right, actually could have been eggs, could have been lots of babies. I mean, we're also used to seeing the classic Noah's Ark pictures of like grown animals, but who said they had to be grown animals? And again, in the last episode, we talked a little bit about natural selection and macroevolution and microevolution, and you're right. Yeah, it could have just been a single species that then changed and evolved by means of natural selection over time. That's a great insight there. That's what I was going to say. It's a theory, isn't it? It's again, we're not saying this is how it happened. We're saying this is how it might have happened. So dinosaurs. I guess my understanding is that dinosaurs maybe could have lived pre-ark, and then they were on the ark, and then maybe came off.
So we can go back to the greenhouse analogy that I was using earlier. That we had a very kind of fitting environment for all of these dinosaurs to grow and live in a pre-flood world, let's call it, the period of time when, for example, oxygen rates might have been higher. There's precedent to say that oxygen that we can see when looking through the geological record was much higher in the earlier history of when these animals walked around on Earth. The flood could very much have affected that. Certainly as well, it would have affected the temperature of the Earth. When one volcano goes off, such as, and I won't try and pronounce the name of it, but the one that occurred in Iceland, which grounded a lot of flights a number of years ago, it changes the weather, put ash into the atmosphere, and it starts to cool the planet down. And certainly, if a catastrophe as big as a global flood that we're talking about occurs, then you start cooling the planet down, kicking off a mini ice age. Certainly, the early humans coexisted with what we would see to be an ice age ending, and that's not disputed. And so dinosaurs may well have survived for a period of time, but the Earth just stopped being habitable for them enough, and other animals multiplied and grew.
Maybe I could jump in here if that's okay, because there's some things that I've found really fascinating that I've read before. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So, firstly, you're talking about the atmosphere changing and maybe affecting the dinosaurs. I've read before that some people would assert that in a pre-flood world, that dinosaurs would have lived a lot more comfortably, but actually with the level of oxygen in a post-flood world, they would have struggled to survive. But where this is really, really interesting is in Genesis 5. So if you've ever read Genesis 5, it's that genealogy, that family tree. But have you ever seen how old people are? They're like 900 years old at times. And you think, hang on, humans can't be 900 years old. And one of the suggestions about how this was able to happen was because of the atmosphere again. And again, I'm not saying that that's what happened. I'm saying this is a possibility, is that in a post-flood world, if you look at the Bible, you notice that the ages decreased dramatically. And in the same, so Sam is saying, well, actually, there was probably a huge atmospheric change. Well, could it be that the ages decreased because of that atmospheric change? That's what brings the ages down from 700, 800 years in lifespan to 100, 120 to 80 to 60 years of lifespan. Sam, is that a ridiculous proposition, or is that something that is?
I certainly think there's that it fits in with our idea of kind of a young Earth, and it fits in well with the explanation of how the flood could have changed things. And the Bible tells us that God anticipated that human lifespan would start shrinking after the flood. He said, your years will be no more than 120 years. And he sees that going on and proclaimed it. There's also other factors that could have affected the age of people. If we're taking Adam and Eve to be the first people with a gene pool that is flawless, and what we understand to be abnormalities in when we reproduce and various ailments and mutations and things that occur as all organisms reproduce, those wouldn't have existed in the early and effectively perfect design of mankind that God had brought about. They would have lived for, as long as kind of God had designed them to, prior to sin bringing death into the world. And so if you combine that with, if you combine kind of like this perfect organism, at risk of quoting that Alien movie, with a perfect environment, one that could keep the Garden of Eden as the lush garden that it's described to be, then it would make sense that when you start to break that down, you change the habitat, you start having more and more people intermingling with each other, and at that time, certainly with less people in the world, it's more likely to be inter-family relationships, and certainly in kind of the broad span of, as humanity spreads out and starts populating the rest of the world, you're going to start to get these genetic mutations building on one another and limiting what the human body can do and how long it could live for.
So these are really interesting discussions. I think, I again, just as last week, we could talk about this for a long, long time. Yes. Again, just a quick summary of what we've talked about. Yeah, global and local floods. There's a possibility that it could have been both. We're leaning towards a global flood. And there are logical explanations, plausible explanations as to what could have happened with things like dinosaurs and the ages in those family trees in Genesis 5. There's a lot of plausible explanations as to how all this could have happened, how the flood even could have happened from a scientific point of view. I guess the last question I want to ask as we kind of bring this to a close is, does this matter? Is this a big deal?
Yeah, and this could turn into a testimony, and I won't speak for another hour on it, but when I went to university and I had the question of, did God make the world in 6 days? My answer was, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. And then gradually, as I, continued as a geologist and spent more time in university, it became the crux of my every thought. And I thought, if God made things in such a way, surely he would tell us clearly about them. And it really challenged my faith until God brought me through it to a place where I can say it's all right to have faith and to not know everything, to the point where I was able to say, I don't know. And actually, for my faith, it doesn't matter in the long scheme of things, given that the gospel is the core of what we're all united in. And so I don't know, and it doesn't matter is a viable approach to it. And it is a simple faith approach to be able to say we don't need to believe one way or the other about the way God created the world, as long as we believe that God created it, and then Jesus, who was the author, as we read in Colossians, Jesus was part of the creation. He was there and he was core to it. And so the gospel ultimately ties us into that and says Jesus is the purpose of all of these things anyway. And so that's certainly been a succinct summary of the walk that God's taken me on.
I think that's so good. I think it's great to question these. I think we can be encouraged as Christians to know that we can really wrestle with this stuff and come to conclusions that are actually in alignment with what the Bible teaches. I would say the only caveat is that there are some serious issues with evolution, in my opinion, that do affect the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And so that's something we have to really wrestle with. Again, I'd encourage you to take a listen to the last week's episode if you want to hear more about that. That's not to say it's completely implausible, but there are some serious challenges there that for me actually was a game changer in where I stood. I mean, we talked about where Sam and I stand on New Earth versus Young Earth, and for me it was the gospel that was the main deciding factor. I think what is important is our faith, like you said, Sam. It's important that we trust that even if we don't know the answers, that God is in control. He is sovereign. I mean, he has power over all things. He's got this. And even though we don't understand right now, doesn't mean that we won't understand forever. There may come a day where we can come before the throne of God and say, hey, Father God, what was that about? What happened here? I'd love to know. And I think God would be excited to show us. I don't want to assume what God would do, but I think he would love to say, hey, this is what happened. And we'd be like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. Well, we can, to add to that, we can see in the book of Job exactly what happens when a group of people just having a really intense theological discussion for 38 chapters of this book come together and say, God, explain yourself. And God comes down out of the sky. And at this point, these Job and his friends have been discussing the nature of righteousness and how God deals with people who are unrighteous. But God comes down out of the sky and says, you can't fully understand me yet. Instead, look at my creation. See that you can't fully understand that and have faith in me when you can't understand. And so that ultimately, and I'd recommend anybody, if you can, to sit and read through Job in one sitting. It's a bit of a bite to do. But if you do that, you can really see the scope of how long these arguments went on for and became very circular until God intervened and said, you just have to trust me because look out the window. And so for anybody who is struggling with this, you can trust God without yet coming to a solid conclusion.
Great. Sam, again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on the show. As we finish up here, I just want to say, whatever side of this debate you land on, the thing to keep in mind is the good news of Jesus, that Jesus died for you, rose again, victorious over sin, ascended to the right hand of the Father so that we could be in eternal relationship with God. That's good news. That's the news that we cling on. The rest here, we're speculating. We will find out one day when we get to be in glory with God again. Until that time, we can speculate and we can wrestle with the science and we can wrestle with the word of God, knowing that actually the answers are there. We may not be able to find them just yet, but that's okay. We hope that you found this a really helpful exercise. My dream, again, just to reiterate, is that the outcome would be that you would look at someone with a different view to yours and say, yeah, okay, I can see how you would believe that. I might not agree, but I'm not gonna just kind of flippantly think that it's ridiculous to believe either view. I think there is reasoned, well-intentioned thought that goes into all of these views, all the views that we've mentioned for sure. And so I hope you found that helpful. I encourage you to look into this a bit deeper. And that's it. So we'll see you next week for another episode of the Simple Faith Podcast. Bye.